So a very warm welcome this afternoon for our very distinguished and honored guest speaker today. We are pleased to have with us Dr. Madhav Godbole, whose recent book is what he will be speaking about. This is, I'll just hold up the title there for you. There it is. So this is titled India, a Federal Union of States, Fault Lines, Challenges and Opportunities. This is the book that he will be speaking about, but let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Godbole before that. Dr. Madhav Godbole took premature voluntary retirement from the Indian Administrative Service in March 1993 when he was Union Home Secretary and Secretary Justice. Previously, he was Secretary Petroleum and Natural Gas and Secretary Urban Development in the Government of India. He has also been Chairman of the Maharashtra State Electricity Board and Principal Finance Secretary, Government of Maharashtra. He was Chairman of several government committees, including the Enron Power Project and Management of India's International Borders. Dr. Godbole has written 26 books on public policy issues in English and Marathi. Of these, 15 are in English. Several of his English books have been translated into Marathi. The Hindi translation of his book, Secularism, India at a Crossroads, was published in 2018. He has written over 500 articles in leading newspapers, journals, and periodicals. He wrote a weekly column for 2 years in Marathi daily Lok Satta. Dr. Godbole has an MA and PhD in economics from Bombay University and an MA in development economics from Williams College, Massachusetts, USA. He is now working on his next book, I should let you know, which is titled Price of Democracy, The Indian Experience. So a very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I will not, there is a lot of praise for your book on the back, and there's a synopsis as well, but I will not, rather than take up your time, I will not go into this, but I will depend on you to tell us a little more about your book and start your lecture today. So welcome and please begin.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury, and ladies and gentlemen. I propose to give this presentation in 3 parts. First is an introduction. Second is a book at a glance and its brief findings. And thirdly is a summary. So far as India is concerned, we are now in the 75th year of independence and 71st year since the adoption of the Constitution. Inevitably, some questions are being raised about constitutional setup, manner in which it has functioned, the fault lines which have come up over a period of time, etc. And I have tried to deal with some of them in this book. At the outset, I think I should mention that India is not a federation. It is not a federation in the sense of earlier sovereign independent states getting together and forming a federation. No, it is a union of states. And so the conscious decision of the Constituent Assembly to call it a union of states, both Ambedkar, who was that time chairman of the drafting committee, and Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who was presiding over the Constituent Assembly, both of them have clarified this issue at great length during the discussion. It is also necessary to remember that before independence, India as an entity, India as a country, as a nation did not survive. It was not there. It comprised British India and 554 princely states. Question was of integrating them. Question was of associating them with the entire process of constitution making. And this is what was done during the making of the Constitution. As compared to many other countries, in India, creation of states is entirely governed by Article 3 of the Constitution. The entire responsibility uh, uh, and the powers belong to the government of India, whether it is creation of new states, whether it is creation of new union territories, as we saw in the case of Kashmir recently, downgrading of a state into union territory, and also upgrading the state union territories into constitution. And therefore, bodies in the sense in which they were in a number of other countries, they were creations of the constitution. There is also another interesting feature which has to be noted, and that is that there is a very large variation between the states. At one extreme is a very small state like Sikkim, and on the other extreme, there are very major states like Maharashtra or Bihar or UP, which are several times bigger than these small states. There are also now 8 union territories. This is again a something which has been given by the legacy of the past, has not been thought over whether it is necessary to continue them. One prominent feature of this arrangement is that the constitution makers visualize that center should always be the preeminent position, in a strong position. And somehow, whichever political party has come to power in the center, as you must have seen, they have all adhered to this kind of a notion, whatever they might say when they are in opposition, that the center must be powerful. And therefore, that concept still continues. The another interesting feature which needs to be noted is that there was a very large reliance on the Government of India Act of 1935. As you must be aware, the Congress party, including Nehru and Gandhi, criticized this act as an evidence of India's slavery. And therefore, they said, we would not like to go by this act. But as it happened, after independence, this was the act on which we relied basically in formulating the constitution. And therefore, a very large part of the constitution is based on Government of India Act of 1935, whatever maybe the criticism may have been the criticism earlier. Now I will come to a few of the major fault lines, which according to me are of some concern. Quite frankly, the most important fault line which bothers me is non-separation of religion from politics. And this is something which is going to trouble us for a long time to come, but there is no political will to address this problem. It is interesting to see that the discussion on this subject started even before Constitution was framed. And in 1947, Anand Sayanam Iyengar moved a resolution in the Constituent Assembly Legislative that a resolution should be passed to separate religion from politics. And except for one solitary member, it was unanimously agreed to. In fact, Nehru supported this very strongly in his lecture, in his speech. But unfortunately, during his 17-year tenure as a prime minister, no follow-up action was. Interestingly enough, though this resolution was passed in 1947, when the constitution was being framed, no provision for separation of religion from politics was made in the constitution, either by way of any specific provision or by way of a mention in the directive principles of state policy, so that it would have given some sanction to this kind of a concept. Unfortunately, even during the later periods of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, when when Congress party had 2/3 majority in the parliament, and also a number of states were with the Congress party, and where all the legislative constitutional changes could have been carried out, no action was taken. It is surprising. I have asked myself this question. With all these towering leaderships during that period, a huge mandate which they enjoyed, why is it that this issue was not addressed by them at all? Was it because Congress party basically did not believe in this concept? Or they were worried that they will meet with an opposition from the party itself, whatever the reason. But the fact remains that this concept was buried basically by those in power for the initial 30, 40 years of our existence. As a result, now it is exceedingly difficult to pass any constitutional amendment because it will require a 2/3 majority in the parliament, and it will also require carrying with you more than half the states to make any such change. But when the Babri Masjid was abolished, P.V. Narasimha Rao wanted to establish his credentials as a secularist, and therefore some movement in this direction was made by moving two bills, a constitution amendment bill and also a bill to amend the Representation of People Act. But no preparatory action was made in terms of finding the consensus amongst the political parties for the purpose. And as a result, these bills failed. And when it was found that they will be defeated, they were withdrawn. Therefore, the last chapter in terms of proceeding ahead with this important subject was in 1993. And since that time, of course, this has taken a backseat. Now, of course, with BJP, with its ascendance, there is no possibility of this ever coming to the fore in terms of any constitutional changes. My only worry is that even Supreme Court of India, which has declared this as the part of a basic structure of the Constitution, has not given any directive on the subject, has not said anything on the subject. Surprisingly, though it has said a number of rights which are not specifically mentioned as fundamental rights, the Supreme Court has recognized them during its deliberations and decisions, but this has not been done so far. Therefore, where do we go on this point? My worry is that since 20% of India's population is of minorities, and if they do not have a feeling of being protected, being looked after, and this majoritarian view not prevailing, then our future in terms of India's federalism is in danger. But unfortunately, there is no realization of this major grievance, major difficulty which we are facing. I'm at least hoping that at least 2 or 3 things will happen. One thing is that it should be made compulsory that for getting elected, a legislator must get 50% plus 1 vote. So it will have a greater legitimacy in terms of his representation in the parliament or in the legislature. Second thing I'm hoping is that the National Commission for Review of Working of the Constitution had made recommendation that the provisions for making communal speeches must be strengthened so that there will be a mandatory minimum punishment for any such offense, which will immediately take him out of contesting an election. This has still not been done, though this report was submitted in the year 2000, 2001. And therefore, again, there is a lack of political will. Third, as I said, the Supreme Court must give a directive that that secularism must be operationalized. Again, there seems to be a reluctance on the part of the Supreme Court for whatever reason, and therefore this fault line is going to remain with us, as far as I can see, for quite some time to come. Let me then come to another fault line which has been with us since independence, and that is Kashmir. This is a very long history, and therefore I have dealt with it at considerable length in this book, because there are a large number of misunderstandings. There is distortion of history. There is a distortion of what the factual situation was on the ground from time to time. And impression has been created as if special rights were given under Article 370 of the Constitution, which have been taken away, which factually is incorrect. You can say that these rights should be given now and Constitution should be amended, but that is another matter. The Constitution never provided any special status to Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370. In fact, if you see the history of Article 370, it was with tremendous difficulty that this article was passed, because demand of the members, Constituent Assembly members, was that if for every state which is to become a part of India, it must adhere to some basic guidelines of the Constitution, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. None of these the J&K was prepared to observe, because Sheikh Abdullah was insistent that he will not agree to anything more than what the letter of accession stated was stated, and which talked about only 3 subjects. And therefore he said, let my Constituent Assembly take a decision, and then only further subjects can be added. Now I have a problem. There is no reason why Constituent Assembly should have been permitted at all in Jammu and Kashmir. Because so far as accession to India was concerned, it was complete. The moment a letter of accession was given by the Maharaja and it was accepted by the Governor General. That is the Act, Independence Act laid down. Therefore, everything else was extraneous. Congress party that time, Nehru's at that time saying that we will ascertain the wishes of the people was again something which was extraneous. So former Supreme Court Chief Justice, Justice Anand in his book has also clarified that the accession was complete the moment it was signed, it was accepted by the Governor General. And therefore, a lot of misunderstandings have come up over a period of time on how Kashmir was handled, and we have largely been responsible. India itself has been largely responsible. The central government has been largely responsible for this kind of a misunderstanding. In fact, I would say that more than Article 370, it is the Delhi Agreement of 1953, which was responsible for creating, giving special status to Jammu and Kashmir. A large number of these provisions were totally against the provisions of the Constitution, but for Nehru's cabinet at that time, because this was negotiated by Nehru's cabinet subcommittee, not Nehru alone, that this was done, and we agreed to a special provision for giving a separate flag, separate citizenship, constitutional rights, emergency powers of the Constitution will not be applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. Article 356 will not be applicable. Jurisdiction of the Supreme Court will not be applicable. In fact, you will be surprised. Sheikh Abdullah himself has said that after this agreement was signed, there was a very pithy comment in one of the newspapers to say, instead of Jammu and Kashmir acceding to India, it is India which has acceded to Jammu and Kashmir. We went to this extent to accommodate the wishes of Sheikh Abdullah. Again, this arises out of the feeling in Nehru at that time that it is because of Sheikh Abdullah alone that Jammu and Kashmir is with India, and not because of the letter of accession, the accession deed. Therefore, the whole set of decisions which were taken year after year took us in a direction in which we created or perpetuated this myth of special status. There was no special status. In fact, this was a temporary provision, as Constitution itself clearly states. This was a temporary provision for a transitional period till such time as, and for window dressing purposes, the government at that time said, because there was an aggression by Pakistan and because half the area was under Pak rule, etc., the arrangements for integration could not be done. This is factually incorrect. The real reason was that Sheikh Abdullah was not agreeable to full integration of the state with India. He only wanted it to be confined to 3 subjects. And that is what his position was right till the end. In fact, Sheikh Abdullah, as you must have seen, is an enigma to this day. Nobody really knows what he was thinking at any given time, because he was saying various things at various times. He talked about independence at one time. He talked about a joint India and Pakistan, Kashmir. At one time, he was thinking in terms of sultanate, so that he will have permanent right as a sultan. And at one time, he was thinking in terms of making it India's protectorate. You may not be aware, but at the time when the constitution was under discussion, there was a serious thought that there should be a 4th category, apart from, there were A, B, C, D, E categories. Apart from that, there should be one separate category in which protectorates will be included. And at that time, there was a mention of Sikkim being one of them. Ultimately, it didn't happen at that time, but it was being talked about. And it was felt that if a demand was made to protectorate, maybe it could have been agreed to. One doesn't know. If it had been agreed to, the whole history would have taken a different turn altogether, and we would not have been discussing this today. But we have landed ourselves in a situation in which both nationally and internationally, we have created a myth of special status given to Jammu and Kashmir and withdrawal of that by abrogation of Article 370. There was no special status at any time. It was to be integrated over a period of time. But our own pronouncements have been responsible for this. For example, Gulzari Lal Nanda was that time Home Minister, made an astonishing statement to say that through the tunnel of Article 370, certain provisions are being made applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. There is nothing like a tunnel. The Supreme Court itself had accepted that Article 370 was meant to extend the provisions of the Constitution as the President thinks fit in consultation with the state government. So there was nothing backdoor about it. But we created that impression. We created that impression that Pandit Nehru's pronouncements, for example, several times said that we are slowly reducing the autonomy of the state. There was nothing like an autonomy of the state. These words were being used very lightly because autonomy was being talked about in terms of Hyderabad, in terms of some of the other states, but this was not an issue at all in Jammu and Kashmir. Therefore, loosely talking about some of these issues which were misunderstood both domestically and internationally have landed us into the very difficult problem. Therefore, I would say that Article 370 has been abrogated, and constitutionally, Jammu and Kashmir is now fully integrated with India. But if you ask me a question, whether it is really integrated, no, it is not. I'm talking about Valley, not Jammu. Valley is not integrated fully as yet emotionally in terms of bonding with India, because we have not made that effort. In fact, everything which we have done has been been in the direction of alienating the people of Jammu and Kashmir from India. Therefore, in my book, I have talked about 17 mistakes done by India over a period of years, which were responsible for all this. And I have now stated, given a 12-point program for rehabilitating, for getting us out of these difficulties, and to make people aware, or to do the bonding of Jammu and Kashmir with India a little more. One of the mistakes I must talk about, for example, I see no reason why an acclaimed leader like Sheikh Abdullah should have been detained for as many as 11 years for one reason or the other. We for once for 2 years, for 3 years, 4 years, and then keep on extending his detention. Gave us a very bad name nationally and internationally. When that became difficult, then we started a so-called conspiracy case against him. When that also could not be established, that case was quietly closed. In fact, Abdullah has, in his book, Flames of Chinar, has mentioned that when this case was on, Guardian of England, London, had said, while Sheikh Abdullah is on trial, India is in dock. This is the impression which we created internationally on a legitimate right which we had in terms of accession of the state with India. We created this, this kind of an impression for no reason at all. For example, we went to United Nations, but we never made a plea that Pakistan was the aggressor. And if you read the Pandit Nehru's correspondence, you will find in one letter he has said, I did not want to say it because that would have further distanced India from Pakistan, which we didn't want to do. At the same time, we were pleading before the United Nations that the aggression was by Pakistan. Self-contradictory. A new angle I found when I was researching for this book was what Sheikh Abdullah has stated in his book. When he talks about, he says that this was not the idea of Jinnah at all. Invading India or invading Pakistan was not the idea of Jinnah. It was the idea of the Northwestern province prime minister at that time, because he wanted to become a sultan of Kashmir. And in fact, this was the reason which was given to Sheikh Abdullah when he went to Pakistan to meet Ayub Khan. Therefore, this kind of history is something which has put us in a very difficult box. And it has, what has added further is that the government of India has kept all the Kashmir papers still secret. I really do not know why they ought to be secret any longer. Let people know what the facts were, what people said at that time. For example, Sheikh Abdullah's grievance has been that 2 of his letters which he wrote to Nehru before the Article 370 was passed in Parliament, these are not made public, while all other correspondence is made public. Why should that be so? 70 years, 75 years after independence, people have a right to know what happened as a part of national history, freedom movement, and therefore this is counterproductive. And it is high time we take notice of this and open a new chapter so far as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. Let me turn to the next subject, which is again very difficult one, and that is the center-state relations. Any federation, if it wants to talk about whether it has made a success or not, will have to take a look at how the center-state relations have functioned. And if you take the case of India, there is a matter of serious concern. Not now alone. It has been so for a number of years, particularly when there is a strong prime minister, like in the Indira Gandhi period or Modi period, you have these kinds of tendencies get aggravated. And this is a subject, no other subject has been studied at as much length and depth as center-state relations in India. Starting with first Administrative Reforms Commission report, then came Sarkaria Commission report on center-state relations. Then came the report of the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution. Then came the second Administrative Reforms Commission report. Then came the Poonchi Commission report. What is common amongst all of them? They made very sensible recommendations regarding manner in which center-state relations should be conducted. But if there is a common feature, it is that none of the governments have taken any action on any one of them. That is why I say that irrespective of what political parties talk about while in opposition, when in government, when they have a power, when they have a capacity to take certain decisions in a matter like center-state relations, none of them did anything different than what their predecessors did. And therefore, if we are going to have a situation where the main political parties believe that there should be a strong center, and they also believe that there should be no discussion on any of the issues talked about by all these high-powered commissions, then where do we go from here? For example, take the case of institution of governors. To me, this is an absolutely anachronistic institution. Nehru had said, giving privy purses to the rulers, princely rulers, was anachronistic. In fact, I would say this is more anachronistic because we carried forward the British concept of ruling from Delhi, a colonial government ruling from Delhi and ruling over the states, democratically elected governments with substantial freedom of press and everything, including an independent judiciary. There is no reason to have a representative of the government of India sitting over the states and carrying and sending reports to government of India every day. This is what is happening now, and not only now, it has been happening all through these years. I have discussed what is the manner in which governors have functioned, irrespective of which political party they belonged, or irrespective of what background they had. There were same kinds of problems. So why do you require this institution of governor? Currently, for example, governor's institution has become highly controversial in West Bengal. It has become controversial in Maharashtra. It has become controversial in some other states where peremptorily governors were transferred like civil servants from one state to another. B.K. Nehru, for example, said transferring governors midway without their consent was converting them purely into civil servants. And that stage has been completely reached in India. Therefore, like sedition, for example, in spite of all the rulings of the Supreme Court and the judiciary pointing out what is right, what is wrong, the sedition law is being brought into force against people by dozens. The only way, the matter is now before the Supreme Court, but I'm hoping that the law will be struck down, because that is the only way in which it can be improved. In the case of governors, the same is the position. When it was way back in 1979 that a 5-member Supreme Court bench laid down clearly that governors are not subordinate to the center. That just because governors are appointed by the president does not mean that they are subordinate to the government. That they are independent constitutional authorities. Now, if you review the functioning of governors over the last 70 years, you will find in each one of these periods, this has not been true. Irrespective of which government was in position, whether it was Congress or BJP or Janta or United Front or whichever. Therefore, having worked with this for a long time, for example, Sarkaria Commission gave detailed instructions what should be, or detailed suggestions, what should be the manner in which governors should be appointed, and what should be the pros and cons in terms of who should be appointed, who should not be appointed. One of them was that he should be a non-political person. That governor's position should not be exchangeable with the ministerial position. Now, what do we find? Whether it was the Congress government or whether it is the BJP government, these positions have become interchangeable. Each one of those recommendations which were made by the Sarkaria Commission have been flouted. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court made certain recommendations which have been flouted. So if you find that politically if it is not workable to appoint the governors according to particular position and to keep them as the as the constitutional positions and not civil servants position, then it is best that the position is abolished. And I have reviewed in this book, and I found that there is nothing which comes in the way which will stop if you abolish the post of governors. The only one difficulty which will arise is when an election is held and a new leader is to be asked to form the government, who should do it? Currently, the governor does it. But even there, the situation has changed over a period of time, because head counting is no longer the rule. It is the vote in the legislature which is to count. If that is so, then that function can also be entrusted to the Election Commission. After having conducted the election, then they can also take a look at whichever is the largest party and whosoever stakes the claim, and then decide whom to call to form the government. But these are matters of detail. I have suggested that serious thought should be given to abolishing the post of governor altogether. But if this is far too revolutionary for the Indian mind, then I have suggested a fallback position. At least half a dozen things which the governors do today and which become irritants should be removed. For example, governors making a speech in to the joint session of the legislature, first session of the legislature every year. There is a lot of controversy throughout these years. The cabinet suggests a particular draft, and then the governor finds that that is critical of the central government, and therefore the governor deletes that portion, and therefore there is it is considered as a slight to the government, and therefore again there is a controversy. This has happened irrespective of whether the governor came from a political background or a civil service background or a judicial background. Even the former Chief Justice of India had to face the same problem in Kerala. Former civil servants had to face the same problem in Karnataka and West Bengal. And therefore, question is whether you want this institution at all to continue, and what will happen if this is discontinued. time, I have also suggested that since people might find it revolutionary, let this issue be referred to the Law Commission. Let them call for public reactions, let them judge them, let them make a recommendation, and then let the government take a decision. But it is inevitable, time has now come to get rid of the position of the governor. Let me now come to the next subject, and that is again a problem which is causing me more worry than some of the others. And that is the concept of state domicile. Whether it should be one national domicile or a state domicile is a subject which was debated in the 50s. In fact, at one stage, Supreme Court took a decision that Indian Constitution meant only one national domicile and there was to be no state domicile. But that decision of the Supreme Court was reversed by the full bench of the Supreme Court, and they said, no, there is a state jurisdiction also, there is a state domicile also. Therefore, we have now got into a box where each state says, I will pass laws which are suited to my own domiciles. And therefore, in the last few months, there is a wave of states, one after the other, passing laws to say 70% of people in both government and private sector will be employed only from the state. In fact, BJP's own promise was that 90% of people from the state should be appointed in that quota. This that we have talked about, whether it is Article 15, 16, 19, 21, every one of them. We do not have any longer the same rights to same right to employment as visualized in the Constitution. That there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex, caste, place of residence, etc., etc. All that has been thrown overboard. And each state, one after the other, competitively, are now saying, my people from my state, Bhumiputras, sons of the soil, they will get the priority. Is this what India was about? Is this what Constitution visualized? And is this the way to take forward what was contained in the Constitution? It is time we seriously debate these issues, and these are politically highly emotive issues. I have suggested that let this be discussed in the Law Commission first, let them give a recommendation, let that be discussed then in the National Integration Council. Some of these institutions, we have more or less put them aside. We have not, we're not bothering about them at all, but these are issues, emotive issues, on which national consensus needs to be developed. I have also suggested, if necessary, get a advisory opinion of the Supreme Court under Article 143 of the Constitution. But this is important enough that all parties get together instead of one-upmanship, come together as a national cause and say thus far and no further. I also suggested that, as in the case of reservation policy, just as Supreme Court has said, not more than 50% reservation. Similarly, here, apply a rule of 50%. Only 50% persons can be appointed from within the state. Balance 50% will have to be from outside the state. But what is at stake is India's continuance as one nation. The new effort to have one ration card throughout the country or one health card throughout the country is a good indication. But these are only the beginnings. Much more needs to be done. And that brings me to the next subject, and that is of division of powers between the center and the states. I find I'm somewhat disconcerted that all these subjects are becoming highly fragmenting. the manner in which political leaders of various parties are talking, this is dividing the country than anything else. For example, there are suggestions now from even some of the chief ministers to say that the concurrent list should be abolished altogether and all those subjects should be transferred to the state list. There are others who say that no, the central list should be expanded. I would say, in fact, that time has come, as compared to the time when the Constitution was framed, we largely relied on Government of India Act of 1935. And basically, what we have in the three lists are the 1935 Act lists, modified and increased so far as center's powers were concerned, central list and the concurrent list. But by and large, they are the same as 1935 Act. Since then, situation has changed a great deal. For example, globalization, international competitiveness, national competitiveness. The NEET, for example, examinations like NEET were sanctioned by the Supreme Court because they were worried about the impact of domicile rules in various states. That there has to be all India competition in a number of areas. For example, we have talked about the new agricultural laws have given rise to a lot of controversy. But for the first time, marketing of agriculture is receiving attention. If this is so, it will also mean a large number of entries in these lists will also have to be looked at afresh. I would say that these three lists need to be looked at afresh, but not with any closed mind of hegemony of states as compared to the center. No, all of them have to work together for the national interest. And what is in the best national interest must be ordained in these new lists which are to be framed. And therefore, that will call for a lot of discussion, apolitical discussion amongst the political parties, taking them out of their closed mindset in terms of powers of the state and powers of the center. For example, when these lists were discussed in the Constituent Assembly, if you read the debates of that time, you will find that major debate was, most of the suggestions were that subjects should be transferred to the central list and not the state list, because they did not have faith in the state. Now, after 70 years, we have seen how the states function, how the center functions, and perhaps there is a more mature judgment on these matters. And therefore, the nature of problems have changed. For example, law and order problem, terrorism problem, these have changed. For example, situations in Godhra or communal riots in Godhra or the demolition of Babri Masjid presented problems which were not visualized when the Constitution was framed. For example, Government of India was totally helpless when Babri was being demolished, or when preparations were being done for demolition of Babri Masjid, because the distribution of work was such that Government of India could have no role except to make available the central forces to the state. All this requires a review. And it is unfortunate, the manner in which the provisions have functioned. For example, in the case of UP, Article 356 should have been imposed before abolition of Babri Masjid, because knowing full well Babri was going to be demolished. And in Godhra, they should have been, Article 356 should have been imposed after the riots were erupted, because the situation was not handled properly. In both these situations, the then parties in power, in one case Congress and the other case BJP, the Action 356 was not used at all. So at that time when they ought to have been used, it was not used. At other times, it was used 100 times. This is making a mockery of the Constitution. Therefore, when we talk about review of the Constitution, federalism concepts, all of these will require a careful study, careful analysis, non-political analysis. For example, another case, restrictions imposed on movement of goods. Constitution clearly stated that there will be that it will be a free market so far as India is concerned, only one country so far as India is concerned in terms of market. But then, as in any other constitution, it was hedging that statement by a number of other provisions to say Parliament will have powers, legislature will have powers, judiciary will have powers to put reasonable restrictions. Those reasonable restrictions over a period of time became unreasonable restrictions. And therefore, we do not have one market in the country today. In fact, I'm convinced that rather than this ideology of a strong center, what needs to be done for holding the country together is to have one market, one holding together the country in terms of all economic activity together. And that will call for substantial review of the provisions of the Constitution. There are other provisions which also call for review. For example, the Interstate Council. This never really worked in Indian situation. If you see, for the first 40 years, from 1950 till 1990, mostly Congress government was in power, but other governments in power. None of them established interstate council in which issues of interstate conflict could be discussed. It was VP Singh government which in 1990 established this council. But Congress party never believed that this institution is the correct one for purposes of any kind of center-state dialogue. And therefore, for 11 years, no meeting of this was held at all. And thereafter, as you will find, there are hardly any meetings. The report of Poonchi Commission, which was submitted to the government in 2010, at that time UPA was in power. Nothing was done till 2015. After BJP came to power, they put it up before the Interstate Council. They referred it to the Standing Committee of the Council, and it is still there. 11 years after submission of the report of Poonchi Commission, there is still no final view of the center state reactions or center state thinking on this subject. Therefore, clearly, Interstate Council is not workable. No government has any faith in this kind of a institution. Alternate institutions will have to be established. Experience shows that a federation cannot work unless you have institutional arrangements. There was a myth at one time that if there is one party government in the center and in a number of states, certain problems will automatically get resolved at the party level and will not require any other mediation. This is not true. The Belgaum Karwar issue between Maharashtra and Karnataka has been languishing in spite of the fact that Congress and thereafter BJP has been in power in both states for a long time, but it could not be resolved. SYL Canal, Sutlej Link Canal, this issue again, when Congress has been in power, was in power both in the Punjab and in the center, issue could not be resolved. A number of interstate water disputes could not be resolved in spite of the fact that they were in the states when states and the center belong to the same political party. And therefore, institutional arrangements are necessary for the purpose. And this is something which will have to be done. Again, I find that there is a lot of talk about cooperative federalism, which is a very good thing. In fact, the direction to go in the future is the cooperative federalism and not the federalism with the dominance of center or the states. But there is more talk about this than action. The only action in all last 75 years is the GST. And GST initially was initiated by the Congress party. It made a major effort to introduce GST in the country. But when it went into opposition, its song changed altogether. And now it is the strongest opposition of GST. And it is now arguing that it is that if it does not have one rate, then it cannot be a GST. It is an RSS tax, but not a goods and services tax. All kinds of statements have been made. In fact, I find that this is only one institution which has shown that cooperative federalism can work in this country, but there are also danger signs. For example, when due to pandemic, payments could not be made to the state for the loss of revenue, there was a very ugly controversy between the center and the states in terms of who should borrow. According to me, this was totally unnecessary controversy. Back-to-back borrowing is something which Government of India has dealt with for a number of years in respect of all borrowing from the World Bank, from the AID and the other institutions. So there was nothing new, but it took such a ghastly turn, ugly controversy, that the Government of India finally relented and said that yes, we will borrow and lend the money to the states. According to me, this was totally unnecessary and counterproductive if you want to take the cooperative federalism further. In fact, you must lay down an example to show that GST has worked so well that other sectors in which similar efforts need to be made, this example should be followed. For example, there is a legitimate complaint that for number of months, meetings of council, GST council have not been called. According to me, this is totally unnecessary. Meetings could have been called at regular intervals. For example, in recently, when a subgroup was appointed to make recommendations on rate structure, etc., opposition ruled states were not put on this committee at all, and it was entirely managed by those of the states belonging to the central government family. Now, this is no way to run a cooperative federalism. Unless mindset changes, both of the center and the states completely, it will be impossible to go any further in this direction. I have dealt with some of the major issues. Finally, I must make a mention of one more recommendation which I have made, and that is constitution. The Supreme Court must be divided to make two divisions: a constitutional division and a appellate division. This is something which has been there in the discussion for a number of years. Unfortunately, this whole issue was tagged on with establishing branch offices, branches of the Supreme Court in 4 or 5 states. And Supreme Court obviously is not agreeable to it. Neither is Delhi Bar agreeable to it. I think the issue of having a separate constitutional court needs to be separated from this other issue of having branches of the Supreme Court in various states. And therefore, I would suggest time has come when the constitutional matters which are relevant for strengthening federalism or resolving the disputes in federalism are languishing in the Supreme Court for years together. The first issue of secularism, for example, which I talked about, the revision petition has been pending in the Supreme Court for the last 20 years. for such a vital issue, which is part of the basic structure of the Constitution. We have found habeas corpus petitions, which are supposed to get timely hearing, have been languishing for years together. The petitions against Article 370 have been languishing. Articles, dozens of instances I have cited where the present system does not seem to work. Also, there are worries about management of the benches, which four Supreme Court judges in their interview itself had said. Also, there is a need to have time-bound action, consistent action in respect of issues which are original jurisdiction of this court. For example, interstate disputes is an original jurisdiction. These have been languishing for dozens of years because Supreme Court is so swamped with appellate cases that the Chief Justice does not find enough judges, cannot spare enough judges to sit on Constitutional Court. And the Constitution has laid down that there must be minimum strength of 5 judges for a Constitution bench. In fact, I have suggested that a separate Constitutional Court comprising 9 judges, full-time 9 judges should be established, which should, if additional judges are to be requisitioned for 13 or more strength of the bench, that can be done by requisitioning judges from the appellate side. But considering the present size of the Supreme Court, 32 or 33, it should not be difficult to take out 9 judges for a full-time basis for a appellate jurisdiction. So I have given you a bird's eye view of what this complicated subject means for the future of the country. Obviously, the subject canvas is very large. I could not deal with a number of issues. For example, interstate water dispute. This is something of huge importance, but I could not deal with it. Another issue, for example, which has been talked about repeatedly, is that while states are keen on getting more powers from the center, the states in turn are not prepared to delegate powers to the panchayat bodies. And that is the Panchayat 73rd, 74th amendments of the Constitution have been languishing. So there are a number of issues. This is a Pandora's box. The federalism is a Pandora's box. I have tried to concentrate only on 10 or 11 fault lines, which I thought are important, which need to be attended to, and have made some specific recommendations on the subject. I hope these issues will get discussed apolitically, without taking party positions on the subject, because you have seen how the Constitution itself was made. When it came to a breaking point on the language issue, the Constitution makers adopted a position of compromise and found a solution which has lasted for all these years. And therefore, this is a give and take kind of an exercise. And I hope we will, as a country, we will be prepared to do that. And I hope this book will set the ball rolling in that direction. I'm indeed grateful to the Calcutta Institute for taking initiative in this matter. And I hope there will be many more reactions to this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godbole. We will now open up the floor virtually to the people who are present here and who heard your talk. So if there are any questions, please just unmute yourself and speak. Yeah, Moidul, go ahead. You don't need to raise your hand actually, because we're a small group. So go ahead.
Thank you.
Introduce Moidul. He's assistant professor of political science. He's a political scientist at our center, at the Center for Studies in Social Science.
Thank you, sir. It's a very interesting book. I definitely would like to read it with great interest. I have actually two questions. One is that given the fact that Ambedkar himself was arguing for a very robust kind of federalism by 1955. His last political tract, Thoughts on Linguistic States, in fact, he was quite apprehensive about this entire North Indian dominance because of the large presence of Hindi ruled states. And his position was very clear that the North India should be, and particularly Uttar Pradesh, United Provinces, then should be divided into several states, and there should be another capital in South, which is Hyderabad, as he proposed. And he of course mentioned in that particular tract that it is possible, given the constitutional arrangement, that there can be permanent communal majorities. And today with the BJP kind of regime, of course, this possibility is very much there. I mean, in terms of the increasing the number of seats as per population proportion, which is all kind of apprehension is there, that the new parliament building in the Central Vista project, which actually will be much bigger, so with more represented from North India than South India. Some of the eastern states in India, like Bengal, might also lose some seats, so in some kind of calculation. So in that sense, the kind of unitary bias that already Indian constitution had right from the beginning will be more strengthened. So what is the future of federalism then? Within this constitutional framework, and at the same time, the practical aspects of a strong leader, as you rightly mentioned, in the Modi regime, you have a strong leader, you have a very strong authoritarian kind of personality cult, and a party which believes in this kind of more powers to the state. So this is number one, and so this is kind of now the follow-up question will be that with the Jammu and Kashmir reorganization bill passed on, and you have rightly pointed out that it was absolutely a temporary provision, even in the constitution. Now, what is interesting is that even the temporary provisions are there for in 371, several other states, Article 371, particularly with access to ownership to land and property in certain northeast states, even under section 118 of 18 in the Himachal Pradesh, a non-Himachali can't buy a property or land. But with the Jammu and Kashmir reorganization bill, we can actually now, technically we can now buy land in Jammu and Kashmir. So there's some kind of discrepancies which is emerging, that you have one kind of rule for a state, kind of abrogation of temporary status, special status, but it's not followed in other cases. So this is something, if you can just throw light upon these two. Thank you.
Well, you have raised very important issues, I must say, which need some elaboration. First is the question of linguistic states and what is likely to happen after the delimitation exercise in the next few years. I have written recently a couple of times on this subject, both nationally and otherwise, that the implications of this for federalism are really large. If you go entirely by the present criteria of membership of the parliament, and it will mean reduction in membership of states in the south and increase in membership of states in the north or in the middle India. And this is something which will create problems of much longer duration than what we have faced so far. And therefore, in the context of the new parliament building and the size of that building, etc., in my article in the Indian Express and in one or two other places, I had said this whole issue first needs to be debated. What is the size of the Lok Sabha that you have in mind or Rajya Sabha that you have in mind, and what are the um, criteria or norms for selection of members, number of members per state. So far as Ambedkar's stand is concerned, I think he had a very strong position so for his strong center when he piloted the constitution in the 1950s. And in fact, there were the apprehensions that the constitution had converted some of the states into municipalities. It's carrying it too far, but that is what some of the members were apprehensive about. And he said, no, or what has been given to the center are only the exceptional powers in emergency provisions, which should always be with the center and not with the states, etc. But that's a separate issue altogether. What has become a matter of concern now is the turn this linguistic states have taken. Each one of them is talking in terms of motherland, my own area, my state, my asmita, my preserving my identity. Now this is from one end of the country to the other. Every state is now talking in these terms, and in a way, as you must have seen, in West Bengal itself, this issue came up when BJP was prominently making a bid for power in West Bengal. Then this issue of motherland of Bengal and culture of Bengal, etc. No outsiders will be permitted to come and govern in Bengal, etc. All these came up, and this is the position with more or less with all the states in the country today. This is exactly the fear which was there in the mind of people, even at the time when linguistic states were formed. You must have seen K. Munshi, for example, wrote very feelingly on this subject and repeatedly took up these issues with Pandit Nehru also. Again, there is over a period of time, the ideology has changed so completely. Pandit Nehru, that time, opposing the linguistic states, was talking in terms of bilingual states, larger states. In fact, he had talked about having a joint state of Bengal and Bihar, a joint state of Maharashtra and Gujarat, joint states in number of other places. Now we have come to the other extreme of smaller states. And BJP is talking about creating Uttarakhand, creating Jharkhand, smaller and smaller states. In fact, their representatives are talking about dividing Bengal. North Bengal should be separated, etc. All these are absolutely wrong lines to take if the country is to be held together. It is time we realize that making states is something, as Ambedkar had said, it is a job of a statesman, not a surveyor, where to draw a dividing line between one state or the other. And therefore, these issues are important, will need to be debated. It is, of course, now too late to go back on the concept of linguistic states, but to what extent some kind of a balance can be brought about even in linguistic states is something which is a matter of concern and which needs to be discussed. As far as J&K is concerned, you have talked about purchase of land rights, etc. Problem with Jammu and Kashmir is different than that in the other states, because the constitution itself makes a distinction between special category states and temporary states. This is a temporary provision as compared to the others where it is a special provision. That special provision is not meant to be diluted, at least as of now. Over a period of time, it will be it will be worthwhile to take a look at it. But in Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, if originally itself this separateness of Jammu and Kashmir was not agreed upon in Delhi Agreement, then the right to purchase land would have been available for Indians even at that time. But 35A was brought about later as a part of Delhi Agreement, and therefore we are in difficulties. I have written in the book that so far as right to employment is concerned, India is on a weak wicket arguing against 35A in Jammu and Kashmir. But so far as land rights is concerned, I'm sorry, I have a different view. All Indians should have a right to take land in any part of the country, and there should be no restrictions except in tribal areas or highly protected areas.
Thank you, Dr. Godbole. There is another question from another of our faculty, Asha Singh. Asha, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, Rosinkadi, thank you. Sorry, I'm in a bad network situation, so I'm not putting on my video.
No problem.
And thank you so much, sir. Your talk was really very exciting and very clearly spelled out. My question, though you have partially touched upon it in your previous response, I would again like to sort of ask. I wanted to know your take on the absence of a clearly spelled out language policy, both at the level of the states and the center, because this has been a major bone of contention for several language recognition movements in India. For example, Bhojpuri language recognition movement. This has a direct impact on people's claim to full citizenship, especially among dialect speaking population. So what's your take on it?
So far, as you must have seen, so far the language has been discussed only in terms of regional languages, not in terms of going down to the lower levels in terms of language of the communities, etc. But in Jammu and Kashmir itself, the state has now recognized over 6 languages as official languages of the state. And I'm sure I've said in the book that over a period of time, the same thing is going to happen in a number of other states where various other languages are assuming prominence. And therefore, this whole language issue is going to be important. But at the same time, we will have to make sure that it is not carried to the extent of further division in terms of medium of instruction, in terms of competitiveness of various courses, university and other courses, etc., because that will be detrimental to the larger interest of the country.
Thank you, sir.
So there are no further questions in the chat box that I can see. Did anybody in the audience have any questions? In which case, please ask. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question, Rosinka. If
yeah, sure. Manubidi, go ahead. This is Professor Manubi Mojumdar. She's honorary professor at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Godbole, for a very fascinating talk. I have two questions. One is about this separation of religion and politics that you have talked about, secularism. So by secularism, if we mean symmetrical treatment of various both majoritarian and minoritarian religions, in that case, recognition of religious rights, wouldn't that strengthen the federal character of the union? The religious diversity across the country. That is, my one question. And second, sir, you have talked about cooperative federalism, but what about competitive federalism in the light of the new market forces and competition among the states? So it's not just about the relationship between the center and the states, but among the states themselves. And that also, you have spoken about this delimitation. So it's a competition between the states. And in case of market, inducing business investment and all that, Rudolph and Rudolph, they do talk about this competitive federalism post-liberalization. So how do these market forces have a bearing on the federal character of the union?
Let me take the second question first. I have discussed in my book at quite some length the need for setting up of a Trade and Commerce Authority of India under Article 307 of the Constitution. This is something which has been ordained by the Constitution all through, but somehow for one reason or the other, for various reasons, this has fallen by wayside. And therefore, I have said restrictions between states, among states, must be reduced to the minimum. And that will call for a number of legislative changes, number of constitutional changes, and that also needs to be done as a part of this exercise if federalism is to be strengthened in terms of making India one country, one market in the real sense of the term. And therefore, the idea of competitive federalism is something which will be promoted further by this kind of a constitutional authority. In fact, I have argued that as compared to the recommendation of the National Commission for Review of the Constitution, they had suggested it should be a statutory body, and I said, no, it must be a constitutional body which will have a greater force in terms of carrying out its mandate. And because these are issues on which there will be a lot of opposition from various states when it comes to the state interests getting adversely affected. And therefore, I have said it should be a constitutional agency and not a statutory agency by itself. Now, second question of secularism. Quite frankly, I see no way in which you can convert a multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society like India into one religion society, one Hindutva society, what BJP has in mind. And that is, it is a non-starter according to me. You cannot possibly make India into one uniform mold of Hinduism. And therefore, it comes to that question about Supreme Court judgment on Hindutva. Hindutva judgment says that let all religious differences be merged together in forming a national kind of an ethos. That will mean negation of individual religious rights of various religions. And therefore, right, for several years, I have been talking and writing about it, that judgment calls for a review. That, as I mentioned, that revision application has been pending in the Supreme Court for 20 years.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from anybody else in the audience? No? Okay. While I give people time to think, let me, as a non-political scientist, ask a question that may sound a little naive to you perhaps, but India is, of course, quite obviously, not the only country in the world that is a federal union of several states. So I was just wondering, while you've talked at length about the situation in India internally, how does India compare then to, for instance, the United States of America or Russia. Even now, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether there is any discussion of the several states that make up the country. And the United Kingdom, of course, is facing a whole plethora of demands for independence from countries like or rather regions of theirs like Scotland and Wales. So this is just a question that comes from a reader of newspapers rather than from any political science person. How do we compare as a union of federal states in comparison to other unions of federal states?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the answer. In between, there was some problem with the sound.
No, it's a very simple question, Dr. Godbole. How do we compare with other countries like the USA or the UK in terms of federalism, in terms of a federal structure? Because there are obviously other countries in the world, and I'm taking the example of one large country and one small country, that are also composed of states. And they too have a federal structure. So what is the comparison like when we, are there similar problems, or are the problems of India unique to India?
In a sense, India's problems are unique because this is a union of states and this is not a federation of states. United States is a federation of states where the states have major powers. They have given only certain powers to the center. Here it is the other way around. It is the center which is calling the shots in all major issues in terms of the constitutional provisions. And that is in fact the main bone of contention in this case. Second question, is India's multi-religious, multilingual society, which is not so in number of other countries, and therefore it poses a different set of problems. Thirdly is the problem of employment, which is now becoming such crucial question all over the country. And that is why this demand that locals must get the jobs rather than those coming from outside, and therefore inside versus outside, that kind of a controversy is not there in a state like United States. And therefore, we are very much different than that of any other country in terms of these kinds of problems and these kinds of emerging problems. For example, India, Senate in the United States, there is a same vote for every state. In India, in India, the size of the states is so different that you cannot have a situation in which you will give states voting according to the power of the states as demanded by your finance minister in Tamil Nadu. For example, Tamil Nadu finance minister is questioning this proposition for GST council of one member, one vote. He says larger states must have larger number of votes. Now, in a federalism, this can clear the pitch altogether and take the dialogue on a altogether different level. And therefore, I think we will have to be very careful when we set into motion these kinds of new ideas of differentiating between the states. And we must realize that in spite of difficulties, India has lived together. As you must be aware, I'm sure you have seen that. When India was born, at the time of independence, the British intellectuals and their intelligence bureaus made an assessment that it will be Pakistan which will be solid in terms of its continuance, and India will fall apart. what has happened is it is the other way around. India is continuing as a strong country all these years, and Pakistan has already split into two. And therefore, there are some intrinsic strength within the country, but we will have to see when we carry on this dialogue about the federalism that we don't belittle the importance of any one of these states.
Thank you so much, Dr. Godbole. There's a question from my colleague Prachi Deshpande. Prachi has a bad connection. Do you think you will be able to ask it yourself, Prachi, or should I read it out? Do you want to give it a try at least?
Yes, I'll give it a try by keeping my video off. Thank you, Dr. Godbole. That was a very comprehensive and talk. I just had a question, partly in response to questions, and that is a way in which our multilingual diversity can be seen as a positive resource rather than a hindrance to a genuinely federal imagination. It seems to me that even the most liberal and federal or decentralized kind of federal frameworks that have been imagined, since the 1920s, have seen multilingualism in the subcontinent as something to be managed, as a problem for the country, rather than a kind of, a site that can serve as an imagination for a new kind of federalism. And I was wondering if you would kind of, I could about how this can be seen not as or as managed, but as something that can make federalism really kind of, way about federalism itself.
The connection wasn't very good. Did you get the entire question, Dr. Godbole? It's also there in chat if you want to take a look at it. Otherwise, I can also...
You can read it out to me.
Yeah, I can read it out.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Prachi, I'll just read out the question as well because the connection was getting interrupted. So Prachi is asking, is there any way in which a genuinely federal imagination can see the country's multilingualism as a positive resource rather than a problem? It seems like even the most federal of frameworks critiquing central control sees the multilingual diversity as a hindrance. How can this be changed? How can multilingual diversity be harnessed for a more genuine federalism?
I think the problem comes when anything has to be looked at in the larger national perspective. So long as it is a state perspective, you can have a language of the state and you can have all the language courses, educational discussions, etc., in that language. There is no problem. But if there is an all India contest on any issue, if there is to be an all India competitive selection of people, then you will have to have a common national language through which you will have to compete. And that is something which is coming to the light now, or coming to the prominence now, in terms of engineering, medical examinations. Even at the Supreme Court level, it has been held that there is no getting away from this kind of a all India test in the matter. And therefore, when it comes to that, you will have to decide on a national language. Now there, whether it should be Hindi or English was a major controversy all these years. And at the time of framing the Constitution, and a compromise formula was arrived at that we will continue with English so long as Hindi does not come up to the expectation of taking over as a national language. And I think that is a reasonable formula, which I think will continue for a number of years, whether one likes it or not. But that is what it will continue. And as you must have seen with the globalization, even in the rural areas or semi-urban areas in the Hindi-speaking heartland, there is a much more acceptance of English than what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And there are many hundreds of new schools English medium schools which are being opened. And therefore, this whole subject, the parameters of this whole subject are undergoing a change. And therefore, another few years' time, we may not be talking so much about Hindi versus English, but talking about both Hindi and English. And therefore, for example, I have recommended that we should recognize clearly Hindi as the 8th language in the Constitution, English as the language in the Constitution, because it is no time keeping this myth that it's a foreigner's language.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godbole. Are there any further questions? Otherwise, are there any questions from anybody in the audience? No. So with that, then, Dr. Godbole, I thank you for this afternoon's talk. We were very happy to hear you speak about your books and to tell us, about your thoughts about this problem that you yourself, as you yourself say, is something that is going to continue and that is intractable, in that not easily solved. But certainly, if people like you continue to provide solutions, to think things through, then that is a way forward. So thank you very much for today, and we hope we'll see you again talking about your next book in a few years' time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.